NASA has been sending satellites to Mars to photograph the surface of the red planet. But what if those photographs found proof of a lost civilization there? A civilization some believe may have also colonized Earth. For decades, we've been sending probes to Mars, and ever since, strange images have been captured on the surface of the red planet. Could this be a floating spoon? Or this, a statue? What about this? The face of a god? But then, in the spring of 2020, things got really strange when an amateur astronomer claimed the cameras on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter photographed this. Take a closer look. It appears to be a group of buildings and pyramids on Mars, one even in the shape of an eagle's head. George Haas is the director of the Esoteric Cydonia Institute. He believes this could be evidence of an ancient civilization on Mars.
The first structure to get my attention is this four-sided pyramid that has a conjoined mound at the top. These are large geoglyphic formations that show intelligent design. All kinds of formations that appears to be a city.
George also believes these Martian pyramids are eerily similar to the ancient Mayan pyramids in Mexico.
It looks a lot like the Pyramid of the Moon in Teotihuacan. You have a four-sided pyramid with this platform or porch that's jutted off the one end of the pyramid. And they're almost identical.
Forensic investigator Chase Klotsky says there's a case to be made for past life on Mars.
There is physical evidence, scientific evidence, that there was once water on Mars. So if the water was there, it easily could have supported civilization.
So where did the Martians go? One popular theory, they were destroyed by nuclear war. The possible evidence? Atmospheric traces of an element called Xenon-129.
Xenon-129 is a signature of artificial nuclear explosions.
A 1 megaton bomb can completely level a radius of nearly 4 miles. But before we mourn the annihilation of Martian civilization, let's determine if there was a civilization at all. We took these photos to the best in the field, Mars mission planner Jonathan Hill. Hill begins by examining the large eagle's head structure. Could that be by design?
We see cliff faces along the edge, nice gentle slopes that are consistent with ice deposits that we see on similar mesas throughout the planet.
Hill says those lines indicate a natural formation, and geological analysis of the area confirms it.
So using ground-penetrating radar from orbit, we can see down into different layers of these mesas to see what they're made out of. And the entire mesa is rock and water ice, and so that obviously rules out any artificial metals or other materials.
But what about the nearby pyramid? George Haas claims it's a mirror image of the Pyramid of the Moon in Mexico. Were the two built by the same hands?
When you look at it, the difference between an actual pyramid is that all the angles are perfect. They were artificially engineered. When you look at a mesa like this, the edges aren't straight, they're all curves. The top is not centered. The geometry is just not there.
And that evidence of nuclear war on Mars? The Xenon-129?
Xenon is a naturally occurring gas. We find traces of it in our atmosphere here on Earth, so it's not surprising that we find traces of it on Mars.
After years of studying the red planet and claims of amazing structures there, Hill believes there's a psychological explanation for what people think they are seeing on Mars, the phenomenon known as pareidolia.
It's basically where the human brain goes a little too far, and it implants patterns where patterns don't exist. And so I think people have to really prove to themselves that they're not being affected by this known effect.
So it's simply a trick of the eye. And turns out that sometimes we'll see things we want to see and not what's actually there. So our verdict? Pareidolia. But don't let that stop you from looking up at the stars for that alien life. We may still find the proof one day. From 1969 to 1972, NASA's 6 Apollo moon landings defined a golden age in space exploration. The awesome imagery of those missions made history, but some people believe that this image reveals a secret history.
In my opinion, that is not a natural structure. It's got to be some intelligent species that created it.
In the 1960s, Ken Johnston was a NASA test pilot, but later as director of the Data and Photo Control Department at the Johnson Space Flight Center. He says on one of the moon missions, the astronauts came back with intriguing photographs.
I was in kind of shock. And some of the craters would actually show domes and actual bases.
Bases on the moon? Ken's talking about these rounded dome-shaped objects in the middle of one of the craters. But what's even more shocking, Ken says when he asked his boss about the photos, he was told to stop asking.
And we argued a little bit. He finally said, I don't care what you do, just get rid of those pictures that were taken.
Is it a cover-up? One thing is certain, Ken's not the only person to believe there's been alien activity on the moon. Take a look at these photos. Some believe this looks like vehicle tracks. How did these things get there? Journalist Alexis Brooks says some believe they could be the work of an ancient interstellar civilization called the Anunnaki.
Their technology is said to be integral in the structures that we're familiar with today, like the pyramids. So the question becomes, did this ancient race lay footing, if you will, on the moon?
The Anunnaki first appeared in the ancient traditions of the Sumerians and the Babylonians over 3,000 years ago. Do these images suggest they or another civilization landed on the moon? We asked astrophotographer Andrew McCarthy to check it out. McCarthy starts by examining the photo of the alleged bases.
Really does look like something artificial at first glance.
McCarthy focuses not only on the structure, but on the crater around it.
When an impact happens, ejecta is flung everywhere. Some of it is flung straight up and comes straight back down. And it creates these irregular piles in the middle of the crater that you see here. Frankly, if it wasn't there, that would be weird.
Next, Mars mission planner Jonathan Hill takes a look at those strange tracks. Hill points out that boulders often leave similar tracks when they roll across the surface, but these tracks are perfectly parallel.
My first thought was the lunar rovers driven by the Apollo astronauts.
Hill checks images from Apollo landing sites and comes up empty.
The United States was not the only country that sent wheeled vehicles to the moon.
In fact, in 1970, the Soviet Lunokhod-1 was the first remote-controlled rover to land on an extraterrestrial body, and the width of its known tracks seemed to match the mystery photo.
They look very, very similar to those two parallel line tracks we saw before. But we still can't quite prove definitively that that's what caused these particular set of double tracks.
Well, we don't have proof that the Anunnaki ever made it to the moon. But we do know those moon bases aren't alien-made, while the mysterious tracks look like human handiwork. So our verdict? The bases are natural formations, and the tracks likely from a lunar rover. And here's hoping we get back to the moon soon to make some more. The year is 1964. It's a beautiful spring day in Cumbria, England. Fireman Jim Templeton has the day off and takes his family to a local park near an inlet called the Solway Firth. 5-year-old Elizabeth gathers a bouquet of wildflowers while her father, an amateur photographer, snaps a few photos of the adorable tot on his new Kodak camera. But one shows something no one can explain. Someone dressed in what appears to be a spacesuit can be seen just behind the young girl's head. Take a closer look at that white outfit in what looks like a helmet with a face shield. Sure, it looks like this guy could be planting a flag on the moon. But Jim swears there was no one else behind his daughter when he took the photo, and certainly no astronauts from this planet or any other. The image spreads quickly to newspapers around the world, as does speculation on what this mysterious figure could be. Importantly, the photo is from the early years of the space age, with both the Soviets and the American programs making regular headlines. So the spaceman theory quickly gained traction. On the flip side, the escalating nuclear arms race fuels wild speculation that the figure was wearing a radiation hazmat suit. Coincidentally, there was a Royal Air Force base used to develop nuclear missiles near the Solway Firth. Some speculated this figure could have actually been a Soviet spy. Intrigue involving nuclear weapons sounds like a stretch, but remember, Cold War hysteria was still riding high just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what's really in this photograph? A visitor from space, a Soviet nuclear spy, or is it just a decades-old hoax? Let's see what develops when we consult our experts. First, we determined if the appearance of the figure was the result of some camera development trickery.
To do some trick photography in the 60s, some would do a double exposure where you're taking two images onto the same slide of negative. Now, that's not possible to create a scene like this, however, because you would see some kind of ghosting artifacts of this young girl. Especially since her wind is blowing in her hair, it'd be impossible to duplicate that same moment twice for both exposures.
So it seems as though there really was someone or something in the background.
If this was a person with a helmet on, then this arm is actually kind of pointing the wrong way. It's not an arm that's kind of coming out and forwards. It really looks like this is viewed from behind. Now, if I was to obscure the head of the person, it looks way more natural as something being viewed from behind.
And perhaps what everyone thinks is a helmet is, in fact, something else.
That would mean that this dark area here isn't actually a faceplate. It's just the hair of the person. So this is a hat, this is the hair. So I think what we're seeing here is a figure, and they're facing away from the camera.
Based on the figure's anatomy, clothing, and setting, West's best guess is that this is a woman in a hat.
We do have another photograph of the scene. What we see here is the mother. Now, the mother is wearing a bluish-looking dress. We see the top here in this region. It's almost white in this photograph.
The theory is that the blue dress and her hat looks white here due to overexposure. But if it was the girl's mother, why didn't the family notice at the time?
When the pictures get developed, they look at them days or weeks later, they just simply don't remember that that person happened to be standing in that position. No one has a perfect recording of exactly where everybody was stood on a particular moment, like 3 days ago or a week ago.
Based on Mick West's analysis of the clothing, we're going to agree and say it's a woman in a hat.
At an altitude of about 12 kilometers from the surface of Mars.
March 2021.
Heat shield set. Skycrane maneuver has started, about 20 meters off the surface.
Bingo Delta.
Touchdown confirmed. Perseverance safely on the surface of Mars.
After a dramatic landing on Mars, NASA's Perseverance rover is looking for signs of ancient life, either primitive forms of bacteria or strands of DNA. To get its bearings, it takes a panorama of 4 images, and in the 3rd frame, it snaps this. A bizarre object appears suspended over the Martian surface. Zoom in, and it's clearly something thin and elongated, seemingly out of place. Just minutes after NASA downloads the image, social media lights up with posts about aliens and UFOs.
Zooming into the image, you can see its shape really closely resembles a bird in flight.
Let's not just take McCarthy's word for it. Here's a bird in flight on Earth. We pixelate it to the same degree as the Perseverance image, and we put it slightly out of focus. Practically a match, right? Percival Lowell, America's preeminent astronomer of the early 1900s, studied Mars with a telescope for 15 years. Lowell saw lines on the surface and grew convinced that they were irrigation canals to transport water from melting polar ice. He took this as evidence of intelligent life on the Red Planet. In the 1960s, the Mariner missions captured detailed images of the surface, and it turned out that Lowell's canals were actually a string of craters. But at least part of Lowell's theory has been proven true. In 2008, NASA's Phoenix Mars lander discovered ice under the Martian surface, so the possibility of life on Mars isn't out of the question. The Perseverance rover is the largest astrobiology expedition ever launched by NASA. Did it find proof of Martian life within weeks of touchdown? Let's check in with NASA geologist Bob Anderson. First, is this all a hoax?
You can tell that this is a real Martian image because the sky is not blue, it's yellow, which is exactly what you would see on the surface of Mars.
Dust particles in the Martian atmosphere are high in iron oxide, which absorbs blue light and creates a yellow sky. So what about an aircraft? Believe it or not, a helicopter named Ingenuity hitched a ride with Perseverance. It has successfully flown on Mars at least 11 times. So could Ingenuity be what's in the picture?
If you see the shape of it, it's a very distinct box with 4 legs from it, with the propellers that are turning. And you don't see any of those features in this object here.
Okay, so it's not Ingenuity, but Anderson does see a familiar shape in the picture.
If you take a look at this object in real close, it's more of an elliptical shape, and so it's very indicative of dust particles that we've been studying on Mars with the microscope.
Winds on Mars can kick up dust storms so big we can see them on Earth, and the dust's red hue gives the planet its color. But Mars dust is electrostatic, which means it clings to everything it touches. So it likely would stick to the camera's sensor or lenses and appear on all 4 images, not just one. So Anderson has another theory.
It actually could be a foreign object from the rover itself. The rover has little blankets and things covered with gold foil to protect it from temperature, and sometimes in the wind and in the sand, those little pieces get worn off.
So, what we might be seeing is a flyaway piece of insulation or coating. It likely blew off just before the picture was taken, flew out a few feet, then dropped before the next frame. So, our verdict? We're going with Bob Anderson. It's not 100% clear, but the bird was likely a flyaway piece of the Perseverance. In 2026, SpaceX hopes to land humans on the red planet. So then we'll definitely be able to say there is life on Mars.